Well, I have got a theory, as we like to say on this podcast, which is that we live under command capitalism.
People vastly overestimate how liberal, how market-oriented Britain is.
What do you think speaks to the fanaticism with which the Polanskiites have made themselves felt?
How do I know they're not? How do you know they're not just Christians?
Hello and welcome back to Last Orders. I'm Tom Slater, editor of Spiked, joined as I am in every single episode by Chris Snowdon from the IEA. How are you doing, Chris?
I'm very well, thank you. Have we got a guest this week, Tom? Do we bother to book on this time?
We did bother to book
Did
one
we?
this time, and
Oh,
we
good.
bothered
Exciting.
to book a brilliant guest in the form of your colleague, Kristian Niemietz, editorial director at the IEA. How are you doing, Kristian?
Struggling with the heat wave, otherwise fine.
It's already outstayed its welcome a little bit. I'm enjoying it still, but
Not just my colleague, my boss, my
Oh, really?
line manager.
so you've got to be on your P's and Q's here. You're going to see a much more restrained Chris
Say
Snowdon.
nothing wrong.
Yeah. But before we get into all that, I just want to remind all of you that Rod Liddell, big friend of Spike, big friend of the show, has his Times Radio show, which we want to let you know all about every Saturday from 10 a.m. until 1 p.m. Rod takes over the airwaves over there at Times Radio for the punchiest political commentary and discussion going. It's not all heavy stuff either. There'll also be plenty of cultural conversation, album reviews, suggestions for what you might watch on television that week, so it's really not to be missed. You can listen to Rod's show every Saturday from 10 a.m. until 1 p.m. on your smart speaker, on your digital radio, or on the free Times Radio app. Also, another reminder that there are still just about some tickets left for the Spike Summit on Saturday, the 27th of June in Westminster. We've just announced some brilliant new speakers in the form of Andrew Doyle, Paul Embry and Fires Muggle. There might even be a few more to come still. So make sure you go to spiked-online.com/events. There really is very few tickets left. And if you're a Spike supporter, you get that discount. So let's talk about the topics of the day. There's been a lot of discussion, Chris, over the past week about the quasi-Soviet positions being put out there by the government in the form of demanding, or at least putting a lot of pressure on the supermarkets to actually cap prices of key essential goods. And I think it kind of taps into something that you yourself, as well as Kristian over at the IEA, have been talking about in terms of the kind of economic model that we seem to have in this country at the moment. Do you want to respond first to this story and then your kind of what you think this tells us about the nature of the British economy?
Well, I have got a theory, as we like to say on this podcast, which is that we live under command capitalism. And the two main ingredients of command capitalism are the government forcing the private sector to pursue its own usually impractical and utopian goals. And secondly, the government, sometimes as a result of that, actually interfering in the price mechanism. The price mechanism is under attack in a way it hasn't been since the 70s, if not before. It's quite extraordinary how quickly people are keen to cap prices and believe that you can cap prices without the obvious effect of creating shortages. I mean, just to spell it out to people, if you cap the price at a level at which the company can't make any money, they won't produce the good. That has been the problem throughout the ages. The government can't really control prices. On the contrary, you've got to have a system in which you have a price mechanism so people know whether to make more or produce less or buy more or what have you. And the most recent iteration of this is reports, quite credible reports, I think, it has to be said, that Rachel Reeves last week was going to tell the supermarkets to cap a certain range of essential foods, but also guarantee that certain brands of these foods would be on the market on pain of being fined. This is on top of the other supermarket fine we've mentioned on the podcast, in which you get fined for selling too much food. They're going to be fined if they charge above the market rate for butter and eggs and milk and stuff like that. And the coercion in the first stage of what planned, I think, to be sort of negotiations. You know how Rachel Reeves has been calling in like the Petrol and Forecourts Association and supermarkets to give them a ticking off for charging too much. Again, just insane misunderstanding of how the economy works. I don't know if she'd actually had these negotiations she was planning to, but the basic threat she was going to make, actually it wasn't really a threat, it was more an inducement, I guess, because the government is already committed to this extended producer responsibility on plastics, which effectively is just a fine for using plastic packaging. And it is supposedly going to cost businesses up to £2 billion a year to comply with this. Tesco alone is going to be an £80 million cost. So there's one source of higher prices for a start off. And the other thing was this, what they called obesity clampdown. A large part of which is this fining supermarkets for selling too many calories. So the report was that Rachel Reeves had said, actually, we can probably drop these two things if you want to play ball with the old price caps. And that tells you a lot about the command capitalism economy, because the extended producer responsibility and the fining for supermarkets are other examples of the government using the private sector to pursue their impractical dreams. But when push comes to shove, given the supposed cost of living crisis that is more kind of predicted at the moment than actually happening, inflation was 2.8% last month, but everyone's assuming this Iran situation is going to lead to double-digit inflation. Not me, as I've said before. She decided that takes precedence over these other things, which is a tacit admission that actually this other stuff wasn't that important. But it's quite telling what issues they relate to: obesity, long-standing obsession of political pygmies, and plastic, a long-standing obsession ever since David Attenborough made The Blue Planet and Michael Gove watched it. And this is a Michael Gove policy, by the way, one of so many introduced under Labour. So that was really my example of it. And it's all been dropped now, apparently.
There we go. But even though it might have been dropped now, Christian, do you think this indicates the sort of nature of the Labour Party when push comes to shove? This is the kind of policies they're going to reach for in order to try and meet their goals.
Well, maybe not the actual policies, but the fact that they're even talking about it, that in itself tells you something, even if it never actually happens. And that is part of the problem with it. This does show that it's the like of Zack Polanski who are now setting the agenda. And other people in the Labour Party, particularly, probably Lib Dems as well, will then react to it. And they so another example of this would be West Streeting's so-called wealth tax that he now wants to. It's essentially, it would be just an increase in capital gains tax. It's not a wealth tax, but he thinks he needs to frame this in Polanskiite terms. And that's part of the problem, that the Labour Party, the center left more generally, has no agenda setting powers of its own. They do know at some level that you can't go full Polanski if you don't want to ruin the economy. And they probably never will go all the way there, but they still have to, they still feel like, well, these are the people who set the agenda, these are the good guys, and we need to sort of signal that we're not too far away from them. And when it comes to price controls, I mean, this is such basic Econ 101. So I used to teach introductory economics, and that was never the difficult part. This is the sort of stuff you really show this in the first lesson, and even the thick students normally get it. That was really never the problem. Supply and demand, yeah, fairly basic stuff. So, and I think the Labour government, they know this as well. They can't possibly think that you can do something about the cost of living crisis by bullying supermarkets into price caps. I mean, the supermarkets are really the worst possible example here. This is the sort of argument that you can't even steel man. You know, sometimes I like to do this when somebody comes up with a ridiculous policy. I try to steel man it. I try to come up with the best possible way for it, if only to make it a bit more interesting. In this case, I don't even see how you would steel man it, because you could say if you have an industry with major monopoly powers, say a natural monopoly, then yes, there you can interfere with the price. You don't have a market price as such. But supermarkets are really, this is one of the most competitive industries in the country, and that's why they have profit margins of about 3% or so. And even that is, of course, that's an industry average. I'm pretty sure that if you could break this down by product category, it would not be the basics on which supermarkets make their profits. It's going to be some fancy wine or something. It's not going to be on eggs or bread. And the idea that you could
That's where they're
so
cleaning up somehow, yeah.
right, yeah. So, I mean, that's the thing. Even if the supermarkets, if they decided to become charities, you wouldn't even notice much of a difference in your shopping bill. And if they decided then to become selective charities, where only charitable about certain sectors, there, I'm pretty sure on the basics, on milk and bread, is going to be far less than that. In some cases, it could even be that that some of those products are going to be loss leaders, that they're not in themselves cost covering, they're more like they are there so that you go to the supermarket in the first place, and then you see stuff that you also buy, and they make some money on that. But yeah, the fact that we're even talking about this really shows, well, your point about the capitalist command economy. It shows that we're a million light years away from a neoliberal economy, which is what we at Tufton Street always get accused of. So a lot of people have this misperception that, firstly, that we currently live in a neoliberal economy, and also that what being a neoliberal means, or what being a libertarian means, is that you just defend the status quo.
And there we're at Tufton Street as well.
Mhm.
And there we're at Tufton Street. There's many
And that,
misconceptions.
yeah, I won't even go into that, but the idea more that being a neoliberal means your message is the status quo is as good as it gets and everything is wonderful. Even though if part of the problem here is that the people who hate us would never read our publications in the way that I religiously read stuff that's put up by people that I strongly dislike. If our opponents did that, they would realize we're constantly moaning about the status quo. And I think part of the problem here, and that's why the term capitalist command economy is useful. A problem that we've had on the economically liberal side for a long time is that people vastly overestimate how liberal, how market-oriented Britain is. And I think that's partly because what happened after Thatcherism, after the 1980s, is less well ideologically defined. So we never had a government that openly said everything that happened in the 80s was terrible, we will reverse all of that. We never had a government that defined itself as explicitly the opposite of what Thatcherism is. And so you just had various governments that were a bit more ideologically confused. You couldn't really explain, you couldn't really say what is Johnsonism, what is Cameronism. And then you have the problem that I think, since the post-Thatcher governments aren't that easily definable ideologically, we just go back to the most recent period that we can define, which is the Thatcher years, and then we define everything else as just extensions of that. I've written about how this is a bit like the way national stereotypes work. You know, for some countries, people have a very clear idea in their mind. If you said something is typically French, something is typically Italian, most people would know what you're trying to say with that. Whereas if you're saying something is typically Danish, well, it's not so obvious. Well, what's that supposed to mean? What we sometimes do in a case like that we go to the nearest neighbor that we think we can define, we have a clear idea of, and treat everything around them as more or less extensions of that. That's why I've often heard this from, say, Dutch people, Danish people, that wherever they go, people think, oh, you're probably German. So because I can see why you would think that, and it's a bit like that with economic models, with political eras, periods. When we see something that we can't define so well, we just go back to the latest one that we can define, and we think, well, everything after that, yeah, it's probably more or less the same thing. It's probably just an extension.
People think we're America, but we're actually Canada.
Yeah. No, that's a nice nutshell way of putting
It's
it.
the public's
This
fault.
wasn't-
I mean,
It's the
to get
public's fault.
to
This
get
is a
on to
recurring thing.
another of Christian's favourite takes. Why is Labour Party doing this? It's trying to copy the Green Party. Why is it trying to copy the Green Party? Because people are voting for the Green Party. So ultimately, it's a public's fault for not the entire public, but a significant minority, a very important minority to the Labour Party. They are voting for this stuff. You know, I don't think that Zack Polanski is any kind of genius. I don't think many people would say he is, but some people think, well, at least he's got something about him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have got the Greens to where they are in the poll. I don't think it's even that. I think he's kind of almost like a Forrest Gump kind of figure, right man, right time. There's any number of people spewing these moronic policies down the pub. He's just doing it on TV, and other morons going, well, that sounds like a good policy. I'll vote for him. And so the Labour Party are then like, God, everyone really likes the idea of a wealth tax and price controls. We better say that we do too. And quite a few people in the Labour Party actually, I think, don't get why they're bad ideas.
There is a bit of that. I mean, throughout the past 2 years, it has been quite striking how vibes-based the Labour backbenchers and the sort of soft left is, which is a kind of indefinable phenomenon, soft left anyway, which indicates just how vibes-based.
Why are they called the
it
soft
is.
left? That really annoys me. Like, if you're to the left of Ed Miliband, you are the soft left.
Well, Ed
Are you?
Miliband is considered soft left.
Is he?
Yeah.
Okay, what
Without
about
wanting
Bridget
to get
Phillipson? I thought it was like the whole cabinet.
Bridget Phillipson, I'm not sufficiently aware
Well,
of. to
Keir
be able to
Starmer
put-
then. He's what?
Keir
He's right wing, is he?
Well, no, Keir Starmer is actually, I don't know, the fact that I even can speak to this alarms me slightly, but he would be seen as essentially very close to Ed Miliband in his politics. He's just become more Blairite in pursuit of power, is generally speaking how it's seen. But ultimately, all these people don't stand for very much at all.
No, but that would make more sense if you define soft left as center left, somebody who is left wing, but still who is generally comfortable with the market economy, and probably not massively in favor of a larger state either. Calling that soft left, that would make more sense.
But that's what Starmer is. He's centre left.
Without getting into these labels too much, these are only labels that make sense within the Labour Party, because they'd refer to the right of the
I
Labour
don't think
Party.
the media
which
should
doesn't
go
make-
along with this. It makes people who are very left wing sound like they're fairly right wing.
I think a lot of it is that people whose politics are actually quite underdefined also gives them a little bit too much.
Ed Miliband's a Marxist, basically.
Well, I wouldn't say that. His dad was, of course, but I think in his case, it's a sort of slightly stranger, melanger thing.
Apple doesn't far fall from the tree.
Well, up Zack Polanski, though, and he's kind of haunted this whole discussion so far anyway. It has been striking the extent to which someone who, as you say, is not particularly politically impressive has been able to set the agenda. We've already talked about some of the examples. Rent controls is something that also, not a couple of weeks ago, you had the Treasury at least having to pretend that maybe they're thinking about them, whether or not they were actually going to do.
Well, we've got them effectively with this renters.
As you made the point of the podcast a couple of weeks ago. But Kristian, have you been struck by just how quickly Polanski, he's only really been a national political figure for less than a year now, has managed to take on this sort of role, this sort of stature in our politics? Because without wanting to be rude to the man, who I've met on a couple of occasions, he makes Jeremy Corbyn look like dynamic by comparison. So I don't think it's not necessarily a charisma thing, to your point, but what do you think speaks to the fanaticism with which the Polanskiites have made themselves felt?
Well, I wasn't surprised, because partly this is simply he has picked up the stranded Corbynites. The stranded Corbynistas, they are now all Polanskiites. And there's a bit of an added twist in that, so Corbynism happened at the same time as peak woke, and you had this mixing of the economically left, the socialist left, with woke progressivism on social issues. And Polanski has added a bit of a twist there, where he brings everything back to economics. He says, look, all the culture wars are just artificially manufactured by the billionaires, and everyone who thinks that, for example, they think that immigration is too high. No, they're just frustrated with their economic situation, which is caused by the billionaires and neoliberalism. And you have the billionaires telling them, blame the foreigners. And they think nobody could possibly have any cultural concerns. Nobody could possibly have any non-economic preferences, which is an odd thing that we as economists, we're often accused of that. We're accused of reducing everything to a series of financial transactions, that we couldn't possibly understand that people might value things that you won't see in the GDP figures. I've never met an economist who is actually like that. But okay, that's a common accusation that's thrown at us. I'd say for the Polanski, it's actually true. They say nobody could possibly have any non-left, non-woke opinions unless they are economically frustrated, and they're just looking for someone to blame. And then you have the billionaires and the Ferrars telling them, look, blame those people, blame those minorities, which is an odd thing to say, because if you look at the rhetoric of actual right-wing populists, their rhetoric isn't so much that immigration or wokeism, that it makes the country poorer. They're not so much talking about economic issues. In fact, one of the stronger criticism, specifically of Reform as a party, would be that until 5 minutes ago, they didn't even bother coming up with much of an economic agenda. That's been a criticism of Kemi Badenoch as well, and that, at least initially, that she presented herself more as a culture warrior than someone with clear economic policies. And it's generally true that people on the political right these days care a lot less about economics than they used to. And
Great realignment.
The
great realignment.
Yes, that's essentially the realignment theory there. It's for the political right, it's actually true. For the left, quite the opposite. So Polanskiism is the belief that nobody has actually any concerns of a cultural type. Everything is just manufactured by the billionaires. And he seems to have this idea that public anger is like a completely blind force. It's something that you can just direct wherever you want to. Somebody, one day, they think they're annoyed because there's been some culture war episode about transgender athletes taking part in women's sports. And he would say, well, no, those people, they're not actually bothered about that. They're just frustrated. Because they're poor and they're uneducated. And we need to read the Daily Mail. And we need a wealth tax. We need to raise money. We need to give it to those people, and then they will stop caring about transgender athletes in women's sports, which is such a mad thing to believe, because these are concerns of a completely different type, and you cannot convert cultural anger, cultural anxieties into economic anger. I mean, literally nobody believes that if if sports leagues were quite purist in their definition of sex, and if they said this is a male league, this is a women's league, and that there's no borderline cases, no self ID or anything. This is the way we do it. Obviously, the country wouldn't be richer because this isn't about economics. This isn't about bringing your energy bills down. It's not about bringing your rents down. But people can nonetheless have concerns about those issues as well.
Yeah. And it's interesting as well because they will constantly say these things are a distraction. These cultural wars are a distraction, exactly the way that you say. Meanwhile, they hold to all of the establishment positions on the culture war. And if you think you really wanted to get back to a discussion about pure economics and to revive some form of kind of muscular social democracy to even sort of state socialism, then you would just acquiesce on the issues of gender identity. You would park the issues of immigration. You would say, you know what, you've got a point about the fact that immigration is completely out of control and that maybe men shouldn't go in women's toilets. Because it seems to me like if you look at pure polling, I mean, there's a tremendous public appetite for more supposed left-wing economic ideas. The only things that's stopping them from going in that column is that they go over there and they see Zack Polanski gyrating on stage with,
Go and look at the billionaires, which is more of a distraction there, really. If your response to every
Is look over
complaint
there, yeah.
is, never mind that, it's the billionaires.
Yeah, it's 150 people. In a sense, I agree that a lot of culture war episodes are a distraction. It's just that the very people who complain about that now, they're also the people who forced the culture wars on the country in the first place. So, I mean, the whole gender issue, this is something I managed to live 3.5 decades or so without ever thinking about those issues, without ever asking myself anything of that nature, because it was just not a thing, it wasn't relevant. And then we had, if you think about the whole woke BLM summer of 2020, again, loads of issues that were just not really a thing until 5 minutes before, and then everything had to be about issues of, in that case, race and racism, and in the British case, that spilled over into now we all have to obsess about the British Empire and the economic impact that has had. And you suddenly, so I remember this after when the first lockdown was sort of relaxed, not entirely lifted, went to a bookstore for the first time, and everything on the display tables was somehow about the British Empire and race and racism. And I thought, well, where does that suddenly come from? This is normally you have anti-capitalist nonsense, and of course there was still a lot of anti-capitalist nonsense. I'd say a lot of the culture war stuff is also has an anti-capitalist undertones, but it was then and the culture war stuff which had to some extent replaced the pure economics. And but it is the progressives who forced that on the country in the first place. And now they call it a distraction because now there is a pushback. Now they realize they no longer have a monopoly on cultural issues. So in the last decade, I say there wasn't even a culture war as such, because it was really just one side waging it. What's changed in during this decade is that you have other people fighting back.
I was reading some of the comments below the line on the last podcast, and somebody said that their ban would be to ban me from filling up a glass from a bottle of water. Can I just say, from this clumsy attempt I've just made, make a lot of noise, I'm not just putting the water into the glass, I'm mixing a whiskey and water.
Exactly. Otherwise, it just looks like you're
Yeah,
clumsily.
that would
having
be a loser thing to do.
That would be so cringe.
Chris, should we talk about some of the nanny state stories that you picked up, starting off with the latest on gambling?
This is really a story about academics making a lot of money from the taxpayer for not very much. So I probably have mentioned on the podcast, because let's face it, we've been doing this for years. We've exhausted pretty much every topic. But I think I've said on the podcast before that the gambling levy, which takes 1% of revenue from most gambling companies, has came into effect last April. And the plan was always to use 20% of this money for so-called research. And the expectation was they'd get £100 million a year from this levy. So I think the listeners and viewers can do the maths on that. And sure enough, they got £22.1 million for research. Now that is, if you think about it, a staggering amount of money. It would keep the IEA going for a decade, right? And we write about everything, pretty much. These guys only write about gambling harms. They're supposed to write about gambling, but actually, in effect, it's only about gambling harms. What's a gambling harm, you may ask? Well, mostly it's just losing money. But park that for a second. They've got over £20 million per year to write about this. There aren't that many gambling researchers in Britain or the world, really, who could use that kind of money on an annual basis. And as a result, loads of people who've never really written anything about gambling are suddenly positioning themselves as gambling experts. And mostly they are just public health people, which is a dubious term, really. I mean, it's very easy to become a public health person. You just say you're a public health academic, really. It helps if you've done some 1-year conversion course into public health, but basically it's a load of social scientists. Not even that in some cases. Anyone can basically say I'm a public health expert, and they won't be gainsaid. So a bunch of people who have written about lots of different things, perhaps in their careers, but not gambling until 2023 when this was announced. I mean, literally, you could look at their CVs. It's suddenly 2023. Oh, here's an evidence review about gambling. Evidence review is the easiest thing to do. You just read what other people have written about gambling and then try and summarize it. So that's what actually most of this £22 million is being spent on. Other stuff, I can't remember the exact titles of some of these proposals. I looked at them all and I wrote about them. There's some woke nonsense, obviously, Tom. In there,
Always.
there's something to do with gambling in the menstrual cycle. That got £50,000.
Did you read? Did you read that? Was it what was?
Well, no,
it?
it's not been published yet.
Oh, I
It's
see.
only
Okay,
been
I look forward to
commissioned.
that.
It's only been commissioned.
Gambling in the male gaze, gambling in the female penis. These are some things.
Well, do they know how to tick the right boxes?
Exactly. Yeah.
I think that's the way art grants work as well. You have to get certain intersectionality talking points into there, and then your grant will be approved.
Well, this is a lesson for you guys. You could be the free market case for trans in the kids or whatever. You could.
Well, we won't take money from the government. It's very important to us that we don't. But these guys certainly will, and they are doing on a colossal scale. But even if you toss up all these ridiculous proposals, and there's very little value in any of them. One of them is about something like spatial distance between. It's basically about whether you live. If you live near a gambling venue, are you more likely to go in there and gamble? And he's already done some research on this in 2024, and he found that yes, you are more likely to gamble in that venue. Not more likely to gamble in general, not more likely to have a gambling problem, but if you live near a amusement arcade, you're more likely to go to the amusement arcade than if you live nowhere near it. So this is serious. It's good science, isn't it? So it's that kind of stuff. But even if you toss it all up, it's nowhere near £20 million. But there's a whole new gambling research centre. I can't remember what it's called now. It's got the term gambling harms in it, of course. Every single thing is about gambling harms. There's nothing about the positives of gambling, neither economic, health, social, anything like that. Only interest in harms. That is £10 million. So they're getting a nice bit of the wedge there. So, well done. It's a story about public health trophers at the trough, getting their little snouts in the trough from ill-deserved gains. And it just annoys me, really, more than... I mean, it's bad enough that the research is going to be awful. It's all going to say the same thing. It's all going to basically say gambling is the new tobacco. We should treat it like smoking. It's so predictable. It's the biggest, it's a massive epidemic. It's like Wes Streeting says of social media is worse than smoking, or just like smoking, or tobacco playbook. It's so incredibly predictable. I would have written a whole lot for half of that. But more to the thing that really irks me actually is how incredibly, talentless academics can get rich from the government for just so little, I guess. It's just envy, I suppose.
There's a little bit of that. But on a more principal point, Kristian, are you struck by just how much low quality research can be pumped out to such sort of media interest? Are people even aware of just how much of this is just political prejudices with a few numbers attached, essentially?
Well, I guess people respond to incentives, and if you know that you're going to get the media attention and the grants for very low quality research, if you know that you just need to tick the right boxes, why try harder? And especially if these are people who have just converted to being gambling experts in the last 5 minutes. And so it probably isn't a burning passion of theirs. It's just they like generally being on the what would I say, the right side of history, and having broadly fashionable opinions. And then why would you be interested in the specifics of that? If you can get your applause anyway, why try harder? So there's that. And that's also why. So another thing that you can already predict about any output coming out of this is they will do what all the other I mean, you've documented this more than anyone. How all the public health groups or the nanny state groups, whatever you want to call them, how they always write the consumer out of the story. So they always tell a story in which there's an industry which is bad. They somehow have lots of money. Nobody quite knows why they have that money. And here are us, the good public health people. We want to keep those bad people from making money. And uh, it's a very so from an economic perspective, it should be totally obvious that you cannot say if there's an economic transaction going on of any sort and it's a voluntary transaction, you cannot just hurt one party uh, of that transaction in isolation. So if you ban, say, the sale of whiskey, yes, of course, the person who produces whiskey is going to hate that because they're out of business, but they couldn't make any money if there weren't any people who want to buy and drink whiskey. And so this is a totally obvious point, but also you should think. But if you look at some of those reports, the consumer somehow disappears. There are these industries just exist purely for the supply side. They're entirely supply driven, and you have these companies and they just somehow have money. They somehow and you will then have the rhetoric of oh no, it's not the consumer that we have a problem with, it's the industry. And the public health people are not the only ones doing this. So you also get this. There was a proto Extinction Rebellion movement, I think 10 years before the actual Extinction Rebellion. They had one of their stunts was they blocked Heathrow Airport for a day. And big part of their rhetoric was that they said, look, we have no problem whatsoever with the average tourist. It's the airlines. It's the airport operators. These are the people we hate. But of course, if you shut down the airlines, if you shut down the airport, where is the tourists going to go? So this rhetoric, I'm only targeting the supply side in isolation, is complete nonsense. But somehow they get away with it, and that's because they tap into this anti-capitalist sentiment. It should be totally obvious that if you ban the sale of something, whatever that is, or if you make it harder through taxes, through regulations, whatever, you're not just hurting the person who wants to sell that product. They might be least affected because if you're just, say, a shareholder in a tobacco company, well, you can rearrange your shares. You can buy, you can shift your wealth into something else. But if you're a smoker, there is no obvious substitute for the tobacco that you want to consume. More so nowadays. But we'll probably have some preference for one thing or the other. And it's just completely obvious that if you're a nanny statist, the real target for you is the consumer. And there's just no two ways about this. But people do this all the time, including one of my favorite hate groups, which is the NIMBYs, the people who block house building. They also have this rhetoric of saying, well, look, the person who wants to live somewhere, no problem with them whatsoever. It's the developers. Those are the people we hate. Those are the baddies. They just build stuff because they want to make money. They build houses and then somehow they have money. Well, how do they do it? Well, the person who's buying that place is somehow disappears. They are Starland out of the picture. And that is the rhetoric, and they somehow get away with it, and that's purely because of this latent anti-capitalist zeitgeist.
It's incredibly stupid when you break it down like that, isn't it? But they believe it. In some of these things, I think it's because people are being conditioned into doing certain things, wanting certain things. But when it comes to housing, if look, it's like, come on, we're against the big developers, but we're not against housing.
Well, in the same way, if you had, say, one of my favorite eccentric bands, I think you want to talk about eccentric bands later, but one that I won't mention is the old Icelandic beer ban, where beer was banned until the mid-1980s or so, a hangover from 89, hangover from an actual full-on prohibition. And I think if we had something like that for some reason today here, you would, and if somebody, probably a Tufton Street think tank, then proposed maybe we should legalize beer, maybe that wouldn't be so bad. You would have people saying, well, but only the big brewers would benefit. And you would have that exact same rhetoric. You would have people saying, well, it's the Anheuser-Busch and Heineken, and they're funding this. We don't have a problem with people who want to have a drink maybe after work, but it's big brewing.
We're just against the only practical mechanism which might deliver it to them.
Yeah. Well, they've got wine, they've got spirits. What's the problem? Because it was just beer they banned. It wasn't like everything they banned. We talked about this on the live episode once. It's very funny. You know the reason they banned it? It was on the basis. It sounds unbelievable even when you say it, but they said, well, a pint of beer is a lot cheaper than a pint of whiskey, and we need to keep prices up to deter people from buying these things. So we'll legalize whiskey and wine, because like a liter of that is not that cheap. But beer is really cheap. You can get a whole liter of.
If you've ever been to Iceland, it's insanely expensive. People from Iceland come to Britain for the cheap alcohol. Imagine that.
And surely the consequence of that was shuffling people onto tougher stuff.
Which they then had to tax at like £50 a bottle, and I'm not exaggerating. It's insanely high.
Incredible. Zack Polanski will be taken up soon.
I get on the plane. Somebody actually wanted to swap seats so they could sit next to their friend. So I end up sitting next to this guy, who, as I say, turned out to be Idiger Johnson, but I didn't know. He had a beanie cap on. It was a midday flight, and he was using Icelandic snus, which is where you get like crushed up tobacco and you have to sort of make it yourself because they ban snus in Iceland. But so people have to, yeah, exactly. So they buy the muslin and the tobacco separately, shove it up his mouth. He was buying 2 drinks at a time. And I thought, well, that's good, because I'm not going to feel any social shame for doing the same thing, which is what I was planning.
I'd imagine you would have felt any social shame.
Well,
about doing that
it's
as well.
nice not to feel any social shame, isn't it? If anything, I feel they got the high moral ground. So we were both necking drinks, so he started chatting away, because he saw I had some snus, and he said, oh, you English? I said, yeah, but you got snus. I said, yeah, I like snus. And we started having a bit of a chat about snus. Unusual, people using, snus in Britain. I mean, proper snus, not nicotine pouches. And we got chatting away, and I think we were talking about the usual things I like to talk about, Yorkshire Ripper, stuff like that. There had been a famous murder in Iceland a few years ago. I'd just seen a documentary about it, so we talked about that for a while. And as we were sort of about to come down to land, he dropped a few hints looking back. He goes, I used to work in Blackburn. I thought, that's a weird place for an Icelandic guy to work in. Called Blackburn Rovers, of course. And as we were touching down, he goes, do you like football? I said, yeah, I support Middlesbrough. And he goes, I used to play for Chelsea, Barcelona. So that's pretty cool.
That is cool.
But my point being, he was drinking 2 drinks at a time because he's from Iceland, and he's got a lot of money. But even he's not going to turn down relatively cheap drinks on a Ryanair flight.
So at a conference, there was an Icelandic academic, and we talked about alcohol prices. I asked him, how much would you pay for a bottle of wine at a restaurant? And he said, why would you order a bottle of wine at a restaurant? That would be insane. Who's able to afford that other than Elon Musk, maybe?
They all drink in their houses. I did find out in Iceland. The idea of going to the pub was like, you sure you want to do that? I wouldn't recommend it.
Shall we turn to our final 2 questions, starting, Kristian, with, have you got a theory?
I've got a theory.
So any little pet theory that you've been working on that you want to share with the viewers and listeners out there?
Well, it's not specifically my theory, but I think I've been banging on about it more than pretty much anyone, which is the theory that nowadays political opinions are mostly status symbols, that people don't ask themselves primarily, is this true or not, but more, what would it say about me if I adopted this opinion? Now, this is a subconscious process. Obviously, nobody thinks explicitly in those terms, but that clearly, so going back to the price caps and why so many things are vibes driven, this tells you that would explain a phenomenon like that. Why did Polanskiism so suddenly take off? Well, because a lot of it is just simply fashionable. And it's the cool, progressive thing to believe, and therefore you just have lots of people who may not be particularly political, who just adopt this on the basis of, this is the cool thing to believe, and this is the cool opinion. And if somebody adopts opinions on that basis, you cannot talk them out of it. You cannot convince them of something else, because you're not just asking them to accept that they were wrong about something and that you're right, which is difficult enough, but also you're asking them to give up an opinion that makes them look cool and that they adopt for image purposes, and you're asking them to adopt one that will make them look terribly uncool, and then that's a big ask. And related to that, I also believe that political opinions are largely autosuggestive. So we can talk ourselves into believing things that we want to believe subconsciously mostly. Viewers who know me from Twitter will know that I'm often quite dismissive of Polanskiites, Corbynites. I often say, well, you just say this because it's fashionable. I'm often, well, you could say, a bit patronizing to these people, and I often hear the accusation, well, if you're saying that people just adopt fashionable opinions, people just adopt cool opinions, you're saying they're just faking it, and they're being dishonest. That's not at all what I'm saying. I think you don't need to be dishonest in order to gravitate towards fashionable opinions, because that's not how actual fashions work either. So if say if we think about a period that is clearly defined by a particular fashion, like 1980s, ridiculously puffed up hair and a liter of hairspray and shoulder pads and things like that. It's not that, so clearly people adopted those fashions in the 1980s because it was the fashion, but that doesn't mean so. And if you show somebody, say a baby boomer, early Gen Xer, if you show them a picture of themselves in the 80s, they will say, "Oh God, so cringe. How could I possibly walk around like that?" So clearly they were doing it because it was fashionable, but that doesn't mean that they secretly hated it at the time. That's not how fashion works. It doesn't mean that you secretly think, God, I hate this. I wish I could just do the exact opposite of all that. And I'd say this is how political fashions work as well. It's not that that people secretly believe the opposite of what they state they believe. No, it's that they talk themselves into believing that the idea that gives them a positive social reputation also happens to be what they actually believe. And this is quite easy to do for things where, so there are things that we couldn't persuade ourselves of, no matter how hard we try. If for some reason it became fashionable to say that the moon is made out of cheese, now there's no way you could convince yourself of that. But if it's something where there's, say, some ambiguity, and for most things there would be, if we're talking about what are the effects of Brexit? Well, you can find arguments on both sides quite easily. There's always some ambiguity. Is always quite easy, and on those issues, it's pretty easy to say nudge yourself towards a particular position, and this is true for not just the fashion examples that I mentioned, but for, say, even personal taste. It's often so. Everyone's come across this story of, say, the tourist drinks some wine on the beach in Italy, absolutely loves it, thinks this is the best thing ever, and then they buy a few bottles, take them home with them, and then they hate it. And it's because they projected the holiday romanticism into the bottle. And I'd say, but this is how it works actually for most things. It's not that the holiday wine is some sort of weird aberration. It's more that, yes, there are some things that we absolutely love, some things that we absolutely hate, but for a lot of things, it's just not so well defined, and it depends a lot on the attitude with which we approach it. If somebody tells you this is considered a classy thing, then, well, if you want to be considered classy, you will be a bit more attracted to it. And if you're the sort of person who wants to be considered blokish, and if you make a big song and dance about the fact that you like Greg's sausage rolls, then you would probably approach it with the view, I want to hate this.
Let's devil's advocate this, Christian, for a second. Right, two questions. Firstly, how can you be sure that these people aren't simply cretins? Secondly, why doesn't the fashionable opinion change over time like clothes do? The same stupid opinions in terms of economics and politics seem to be pretty much constant for about 200 years.
Well, we've seen a lot of fashion changes in recent years. So peak woke, a lot of the woke progressive stuff is something that came, well, I don't want to say out of nowhere, but you can really see a massive uptick from the early to mid 2000s. There's all these media analyses, literature analyses, where you look at the frequency with which particular terms, words like transphobia, how often are they used in the media, in books, in academic studies, and so forth. And you really see for any woke word that you want to pick, subconscious bias, racial capitalism, that sort of stuff. You see from about 2012, 13, 14 onwards, a massive explosion all the way to the early 2020s, this decade, and then a plateauing or even the decline. So there you do have fairly rapid fashion changes, and you do see some people. Well, it's not that it's not the same effect as, say, with the 1980s photo where you would openly say, "Oh, this was me in the 80s. How cringe." But it's more that you just no longer talk about it and treat it as a bit of a okay, let's not go there. Um, and on the first question,
How do I know they're not? How do you know they're not just Christians?
well, because it's often people who, in a different context, would see the the flaw in that logic. So I've seen several articles in recent years arguing about how we shouldn't use per capita figures. So for things like crime, also because we should not,
Really? Why?
because it's far right.
Right. Well, that sounds like a crescent.
Well, but the same person, if you told the same person, uh, look, objectively, in absolute terms, the police in the United States arrest more white people, they would immediately say, well, that's because there are more white people, and that they would never fall for it. But if you, say, make an anti-per capita point that leads you to a woke position, they suddenly accept the logic when they wouldn't in other circumstances. So it's not that they don't get basic math.
I have a theory, which actually you've just reminded me of, which is that people who say that the Rolling Stones are better than the Beatles are just trying to have an interesting and contrarian opinion. I find it very hard to believe that anyone could actually believe that. But at the same time, some people just have bad music taste or don't like music that much. I think it's so obviously objectively true that the Beatles are better than the Rolling Stones. You may disagree with Kristian. Could be interesting, and you see interesting new division. It's so obvious to me that the Beatles are better than the Rolling Stones. No, I'm not anti Rolling Stones particularly, but I think that the people who say they like the Rolling Stones just like the vibes of the Rolling Stones a bit more, and like the vibe of not thinking the Beatles are the best band in the world. But it could easily be that they simply don't like music, and they struggle with anything more complicated than 12-bar blues.
Well, what I'm saying is that it could well be that somebody is attracted to a position like that initially because they think it makes them look interesting or whatever, but that person is, say, if when they go home and nobody's watching, nobody's listening, they will listen to the Rolling Stones. It's not that they secretly locked. It's not that they
Listen to Beatles, you mean?
no, the ones who say the Stones are better.
Yeah.
I think they will actually listen to the Rolling Stones.
Oh, right, yeah.
It's not that they will lock themselves in the basement and then secretly listen to the Beatles.
No.
But it's a bit more like, and this is true for lots of tastes that may initially be adopted for signaling reasons. Say, if you think of somebody who goes to the opera and you have the suspicion, well, you're clearly attracted to that because you know that the opera is considered highbrow and classy. But that doesn't mean that that person actually sits in the opera and secretly thinks, God, I hate this. This is so boring. I'd rather be at a pop concert now. It may be that initially they are attracted to the positive social reputation, but then you nudge yourself into actually believing it. So the first music, the first CDs I bought at school, it was clearly stuff that was considered cool in the mid-90s, and it was initially for that reason. But that doesn't mean that I then went home and secretly listened to something else. I actually was listening to all that stuff at home when clearly nobody was watching, nobody was listening. I didn't there do it for image reasons, but in hindsight I can tell, well, I nudged myself into liking this because this was the cool thing to like at the time.
What's your band, Kristian?
You are a dictator.
Well, one would be backpacks on the London Underground. I'm sure somebody has brought that up before, because I simply don't believe that people need to carry so much stuff around. I think they really think of themselves as so if you've just come back from a hiking trip through the Australian outback and you've just landed at Heathrow, then you have a right to carry a backpack around with you. But
Oh, you mean a full backpack, not just like a little
or
rucksack?
even a little rucksack.
Even the little ones are annoying.
Well, the trouble is they take up almost twice as much space, and they forget that they have
Even
them.
if you got it, just take it off. That's the
They're
other thing.
worse than wheelie suitcases. In a way. And my God, there's a lot of wheelie suitcases around today, Tom. We are filming this during the heatwave, folks, and the tourist season has really begun. Half term, there are so many wheelie suitcases around today, getting me down.
The people with the wheelie suitcases, they probably really are either tourists or they've been on a trip somewhere. They have stuff that they carry around with them. The people with the backpacks, I think they feel a bit adventurous about themselves. They feel a bit like adventure travelers when they really just going to an office in the Tower Hill area.
Yep. Big yes to backpacks on London Underground. Anything else that you think would?
Yes, retweet begging, as well as whatever the
Asian
equivalent.
farming.
I guess, yeah, that's one form of it. But at the most explicit, there would be the sort of tweet where somebody says, if you agree, please retweet. Or, can we get this up to 100,000 retweets? If you do that, you're clearly not interested in being right on an issue. You're clearly picking something that you know will go down well, and you're trying to deliberately make it, nowadays. But it existed even before you could monetize it. And there are even people where I have no reason to believe that they're in it for the money, but they just love the attention and the popularity.
As Wes Streeting says, social media is the new tobacco. It's been designed, just like cigarettes, to make it addictive.
You have a point, but I think there would also be, if we want to extend this petty ban a little, I wouldn't just make it about the retweet beggar, the person who literally does say please retweet. I think ideally social media should have no function where you can tell how popular or unpopular your opinion is. So because if we think about the early discussion forums, online discussion forums before it was called social media. So I started. I learned about what the internet is in the late 90s. And this was before Twitter, Facebook, and so forth existed, but we had discussion forums already. And you could say they are an early version of social media, and social media evolved out of that. What was different about them was that you had no way of knowing whether what you were saying was popular or not, because there was no equivalent of the like button, the retweet button. Now, if you had 20 people replying, saying this is rubbish and you're the worst person ever, then you could guess this is probably not a popular take. But so that there was one small libertarian forum, which I remember from the early 2000s or so, and one of the first websites where I spent too much time arguing with strangers on the internet. I kept posting on that for maybe 2 years or so or longer. I had absolutely no idea, and still don't, whether I was popular or whether I was hated on that forum. And you shouldn't know, ideally, because once you cannot make yourself popular intentionally, or you don't have that feedback mechanism, you have no or much less of an incentive to say things that you think will go down well, because you won't even know whether it's going down well or not if you don't have the feedback.
Yeah, that's how the school shootings get going. They don't know what they're saying is really unpopular. They go, no, don't do that, mate. Don't do that. It's kind of, no one's disliked that. So I guess I'll do it.
The downside of those forums was they were too small. Everything was massively fragmented. That's why nobody called it social media. There was no Twitter equivalent in the sense of a forum that everybody uses. But you could easily imagine a version of Twitter where people can retweet everything and it can reach loads of people. But you, the person who posted it originally, you're never going to know that. It could be that half of the world's population is reading your tweet right now. It could be that only 2 followers are seeing it. People who stand in the bar area in a pub when it's busy, and they just linger in the bar area once they have their drinks. And you need to shout your orders over 3 rows of people, and then they don't hear you properly, and then you have to repeat it. And I think you should, once you have your pint, and say there should be a margin of plausible, so you could be maybe wandering around a little, but after a minute or so you should be getting mild electric shocks.
Moved on, yeah.
And that they should gradually escalate until you move out of the way.
I think usually what happens in those kind of pubs is those people are there first. I mean, like they've been there for hours when the place fills up, and so they kind of just don't notice it. Or they feel, I've been here before you, so I'm just going to continue blocking about. But they can be very irritating, especially in country pubs with small bars. It's a pet peeve of my dad's, actually.
Thank you very much, Kristian. Take that backpack off, stop begging for retweets, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Last Orders. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you subscribe and click the bell so you never miss another spiked video. If you're listening to this on your podcast app, make sure you subscribe there and give us a glowing 5-star review. And if you'd like to get in touch with your questions or band suggestions, email us at lastorders@spiked-online.com.